Um, this is my distinct pleasure now then, because I get to introduce some of my good friends who I had the great pleasure of working with this summer, Andrew and Ilse. We worked together at the Conventiculum Bostoniense in person this summer, which was a wonderful experience. I can't say enough nice things about these two. Andrew, also Andreas, right, is a Latin teacher at Woodstock Academy in Connecticut, and he's also the co-founder of Latinitas Animi Causa, where he teaches and produces content with a focus on SLA theory and joyful language experience. When he's not teaching, he does archery, plays guitar, enjoys gaming, singing, I know, karaoke, and spending time with his family. And Ilse is pursuing a PhD in classical studies at Boston University. She's the other founder of LOC, Latinitas Animi Causa, habesmeloc.com, which aims to promote inclusive and active language instruction when not busy with Latin or ancient Greek activities. She enjoys exploring, playing World of Warcraft, and spending time with her family as well. So they're going to be speaking today on Vera, authentic resources for ancient languages. So I will turn it over to them now. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much.
Oh,
we are in different places. Andrew's in Florence. So we can.
Yes, we had originally planned to do this talk in the same location. I apologize. There might be some slight interruption. We'll try our best. I apologize. We were going to be in the same location when we first designed this talk, and then I was asked by Greco Latino Vivo to come teach in Italy, and I couldn't say no to going to Italy, so I am currently in Florence right now. And so I am sorry for interrupting before Ilse, and we will bear with us as we sometimes, solve that REM. Right, as they say. Bene, okay. I will share the presentation. Bene, and I think Ilse is actually in my classroom. Is that right?
What? Oh,
You're
yes,
in my classroom.
Yes, this is not my classroom, obviously. This is Andrew's classroom. So you can see, look at all these novellas. It's a nice classroom.
Yes. Bene, so our talk is
Vera.
authentic resources and their place in the ancient language classroom. Now, I want to recognize that the title of this talk is, Ad Aspera Per Cameras, so there is an online component attached to this, right? When we talk about authentic resources, one of the things we want to mention is that a lot of these resources are now being produced online and through other various electronic, I guess, or internet media, not to sound like a 50-year-old person talking about the internet, but they're all sort of produced in these various forms, right? And so we're going to be talking about authentic resources in their production. And also, I think, Dikas, Ilse.
Sure, and they're specifically and how we can use them. Are they useful for our classrooms?
Optime. Bene. Okay. So, Quinam sumus. Right, so Ekeme Adsum Andreas, right? I am one of the co-founders of Latinitas Animi Causa, as mentioned by Gregory Stringer. I got my bachelor's and master's degree both at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. My master's degree is an MAT, so with a focus specifically on language instruction and teaching. And I now teach with the Woodstock Academy, but I've taught online in other various forms through Telepaidea, through LOC, through private tutoring, and so on. So that's a little bit about me. Ilse, Dikas, Dete.
So I have a similar background. Andrew actually taught when he was living in South Africa with me. He started teaching online as a way to, make some money and still speak Latin. And I remember countless days where he would just be speaking Latin the whole day. Which was a lot of fun. And then he started teaching with Telepaidea, and then we started our business, our business / content creation / all encompassing whatever we feel like doing, which is kind of the title, right? Latinitas Animi Causa, just whatever, Latin for funsies and stuff. Andrew's brainchild, the naming, he's much better at that than I am. And so we met at a Latin immersion event. We fell in love at a Latin immersion event. We we both find joy in speaking Latin, speaking ancient Greek, and we both want to make sure to spread that joy, to be a source of that joy, and obviously therefore a source of the education of those languages, so that so it's kind of twofold. It's joy and education, and that's not just for, you know, specific people. We want to make sure that it's more of an accessibility thing. So we want to make sure that we can bring that to as many people as possible, while still, you know, feeding ourselves. So I think a lot of people here are very familiar with both of these two things. So
Indeed.
that is,
you can tell by my increased pants size that I am very familiar with the act of feeding myself, right? But no,
so yes, that's
just
a bit
kidding.
of a do you want to slide? So the goals of this talk specifically is to redefine the term authentic resource. So I'm so happy that I came up today in today's talks, specifically in Gregory's talk just now. So just to redefine the term authentic resource within the context of second language acquisition theory, which is obviously where we are kind of, you know, focusing a lot of our pedagogical interests on, not just because we teach Latin well, mostly because we teach Latin as a language, right? Not just as a mathematical equation. That's what we're trying to do in general. And then also just to recontextualize ancient and modern resources within that theory, and therefore within our classrooms. So before we get into what SLA says about authentic resources, I want us to just quickly think about what we consider in classics as an authentic resource, right? And just for you, it's not a rhetorical question, because I want you to think about it and answer it, but to yourselves. You don't have to necessarily type that in the chat or anything like that. So I'm just going to read through them, and as I read them, just think about whether right now you think that this is considered authentic, either by you or by classics as a field. Cicero's Catilinarian speeches, the biography of Charlemagne by Einhard, Erasmus's colloquies, the dialogues of Comenius, Lingua Latina per se illustrata by Orberg, Latin podcasts or YouTube videos, tiered readings of Seneca's letters, Quintilian's treatises on rhetoric, the Passio Perpetuae et Felicitatis, the poetry of Martha Marquina, Wheelock's Latin, current genre of Latin novellas, a blog written in Latin, and asking your students ut vales, right? So just questo. Dicas.
Oh, bene. So yes, also like these, obviously this is not encompassing of all things that can exist of resources in Latin. These are just some examples we picked of various media and various text types. Right? When we talk about text types and SLA theory, we're talking about media through which languages are interpreted, right? So that can include readings, both things that we read, also they can include oral input, oral output, so on and so forth, that are different text types. So just a bunch of different things, not specifically picked for any reason or the other. And so how are authentic resources defined in SLA theory? Well, we have another picture of this common ground, which I see here is getting a lot of mentions at this conference, as it should, right? Because mea sententia, this is the sine qua non of language textbook. I think every person who is entering language teaching should have a read through this textbook. Not only is it well written and enjoyable, but also it's full of wonderful information, right? So the definition provided by Henshaw and Hawkins, is sort of a collation of SLA researchers, is authentic resources are any type of materials that have not been created for a language learner, right? They are not explicitly created for the purpose of language learning, right? Before we go a little bit further in talking more about some of these authentic resources, I want to talk a little bit about some of the difficulties that exist for the label authentic, right? There are a lot of things that come to mind, like some biases or some connotations that exist in the word authentic that I think we should talk about, right? Yes, I agree also, Carl, I see in your comments that I really like that definition also of authentic resources, text not made for language learners, because that is primarily what it's all about, right, is when we talk about authenticity. Now, the term authentic obviously often has the connotation of something that's good, right? But we want to make sure that we dispel sort of that connotation when we're talking about authenticity. It's not about good or bad or useful or not useful. So for instance, the first question, does authentic always mean good or useful for our students or for us as learners? right? If you are with a Latin 1 student and you are handing them Cicero, I would argue no, right? But might that be helpful or useful for an advanced language learner? Again, different things, right? Does authentic mean used for the original purpose for which the work was developed, right? There are some SLA researchers who would go so far as to say that the work or the resource cannot be considered authentic if it is used contrary to the original purpose for which it was written, right? I don't know if I would necessarily go that far, but that is something that we should also keep in mind when discussing authenticity and some difficulties with the term authentic, right? Does the use of authentic resources mean good teaching and the non-use of it bad teaching? Again, this is something that I think all of us would agree is not true. Like the use of authentic resources might not mean you're necessarily teaching well, and vice versa, right? Just authentic resources are just that. Does an authentic resource need to have been created by native speakers? This is something that's still talked about a lot currently in modern languages, and so it's also worth us talking about it in ancient languages because none of us are native speakers, right? And unless we use a shovel, I don't think we'll ever be able to get one, right? So as a result, right, when we talk about authentic resources, we should consider what that means. And does that mean that people who are non-native speakers can never produce authentic resources? Again, I would argue that we can still produce authentic resources despite not being specifically native Roman Latin speakers. But this is a question that's often brought up and important to think about. What is the role of communicative practice using this resource, right? An authentic resource not used communicatively might not be the best use of that authentic resource, right? Do inauthentic resources always use a natural language form? I put in parentheses Latinitas, though this is indeed a thorny term and not specifically one that and one that I believe should never be used to cast judgment, right, upon others. But I think that within the definition provided by the Rhetorica ad Herennium, that sort of falls into what Latinitas is defined as, the absence of barbarism and solecism as it's defined there. So that natural language form according to Latin, according to them at that time, right, which is, again, it's a thorny definition and not perfect. But and what benefit do we gain from worrying about if a resource, that should be a resource, not a resources, that's my bad, a resource is authentic, right? I would argue, and I think we would both argue that not a lot of benefit is gained from worrying about the authenticity of the work. But these are some things to keep in mind when we're discussing the resources that we are going to discuss going forward, right? So, which is considered,
especially considering the fact that what we were just talking about, how at universities, for example, and in many other programs, if you're moving towards an AP in high school, for example, that we have to get to the authentic Latin, right? We have to get to the real Latin. And that's really where this comes in, is just this idea of how useful are authentic resources and what do we define as authentic resources. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. Gratias adendi, right? Exactly, adenti, potios. So exactly, right? So then if we look again, looking at the definition we have, developed for learners or not developed for learners, we can talk about what is and what isn't authentic according to that. Again, authentic with that definition, not authentic as in good or bad. I want to make that very expressly clear, right? So Cicero's Calenarian speeches, I think we can agree, is an authentic resource. It wasn't created for language learners specifically. It was created to make Catalan feel like a bad person, right? Bennett. And then we have the biography of Charlemagne by Einhard, right? This is about the transmission of the life and communicating the life of Charlemagne as written by him. I think we would, again, agree that that would be an authentic resource. I'm just going to skip around here and not do all of them, right? So the dialogues of Comenius, right, were made and developed to be student texts, right? They're made for language learners specifically. This would be classified as a quote-unquote inauthentic resource, again, as in not developed specifically for language learners, right? Oh, this is, I see Carla's question. I'm just going to quickly say, quickly respond to it, right? Another question mark, authentic resource. Is a translation from another language an authentic resource? I would also agree, yes, and almost all SLA researchers agree that yes, a translation of a work is considered an authentic resource, right? A translation of a work is often considered an authentic resource by SLA researchers. So I would also agree with what Seamus said there, right? In response to your question, yeah, LLPSI, right? Developed for language learners, authentic, not quite, useful, I'd say yes, right? Podcasts and YouTube videos, this will all depend on the podcast and YouTube video, right? As to the purpose for which it was developed. Is it used for language learning? Is it used for entertainment? What is the purpose of it? Tiered readings and graded readings, or graded readers, like the one like of Seneca's letters here, are often considered to be, and I think should be considered, authentic resources. What about translation made for language learning? Mike's translation of A Greek Boy at Home. Oh boy, now we're getting into the weeds. It's a great question there, Gregory. I would argue, I don't know what I'd say.
How about we talk about this is very important, and we talk about it after the presentation.
Probably a better idea. I apologize. I have this like distracted mind where I see the thing on the chat and I'm like, oh, I need to talk about that too. I apologize, folks, for that. Anyway, so
let's go.
Right. Quintilian's treatises on rhetoric, right? Passio Perpetuae, so on and so forth. One I want to highlight here sort of is Wheelock's Latin, right? Because one of the things that Wheelock's prides itself on is its use of real, I'm putting in quotation marks, real Latin from the very beginning, right? And thus perhaps is made to be in a situation where it's sort of a authentic resource, right? But is that necessarily a useful resource for language learning? Well, nil dicam. But let us continue on to the next slide, right? So again, like these are some other things that we just want to keep in mind when we're talking about authenticity, right? Is it always clear and distinct, right? As was mentioned in the question by Gregory, I think this is important. What about a translation made for language learning, like Mike's translation of A Greek Boy at Home, right? That is that an authentic resource, right? These things aren't black and white, and nor should we consider them to be, right? Very few things in life are, but they all exist in some sort of spectrum, right? So it's important for us to think about that and consider that when developing things. LLPSI, right, is an inauthentic resource in the fact that it's developed for language learners, but includes authentic texts in later chapters, right? And is sourced from authentic reading, right? So how do we define this? It's not as fixed and easy as it is or it isn't. So onward and upward we go, right? So, authentic resources versus resources made for language learning. Is one more useful than the other, right? I think that depends on our goals. I think it depends on our fluency levels. I think it depends on what we're specifically doing. And I don't know that there's an answer, or there should be an answer to whether one is more useful than the other, because neither of them, like authentic resources and languages and resources crafted for language learners, both have useful and important uses, that fill the needs of our students, right, and fill the needs of us as language learners, right?
Exactly. And we could think of asking a student, right, utwales, as a type of authentic resource, an authentic text, right? They are interacting with us. It's at least an authentic experience at the very least. And so that is still very useful, right? And actually Henshaw talks about the fact that both of these are useful for different reasons. And it comes down to what are the pros and cons of using an authentic resource in your class. Can you go to the next slide?
Yep.
So why use them, right? Some of the pros and cons. And she actually talks about the fact that the pros and cons of authentic resources are like almost exactly the opposite of the pros and cons for using resources made for language learners, right? And for her, that indicates that they're both useful, and they both can be very useful in classes. So some of the pros of using authentic resources, as SLA as termed in SLA theory, is that it makes language come alive, right? It gives some life that we don't always find in Marcus Puellum Pulsat, right? I mean, although my students do really enjoy that stuff, but like it's just it gives something else to the language. It also can naturally integrate culture, right? And here I think of something more along the lines of authentic in terms of what we would traditionally think of authentic, right? So in Seneca, right, it more naturally integrates culture, not necessarily the authentic resources that, according to SLA theory, we can make now. although we can still do that, and like Orbor can still do that, even though it's not termed an authentic resource. So anyway, and also authentic resources are often more engaging for students, right, than teacher-made materials. That kind of goes with the language come alive thing, at least the example that I gave. And then it can be a rewarding experience for our students to understand something that wasn't made for them to learn the language, right? This is just made by somebody. It's just a fun thing that they did, or something that they did that wasn't meant to be necessarily an educational resource, but they understood it, and that can make them feel even more engaged in the language and engaged in the process of learning this language. So I've seen this with my students. I had a student who came the second week of classes. He came to a Latin speaking hour, and he couldn't stop with his Latin stuff. He was just so into Latin for the next week, at least, right? Very, very excited about it, and like all in. And he's not a classics major or anything like that. So you can see that how that can come, I can elicit that type of response in students. The cons are that it's more difficult for learners to understand without the scaffolding, right? And this is actually one of the bigger problems, because then as a teacher or as an instructor, you have to either create those the scaffolding necessary, right? The activities that we need for that. And some people just don't, like, you're unsure of how to approach that, right? I know that for some of our, we had a friend who reached out, and she had made for one of her students these extra scaffolding things to go along with our podcasts. So, and the student then understood a lot of it, and they had to answer questions. And so those things are possible. It's just not always as easy to integrate into our classrooms, right? Even though they have these great pros that come along. And I know for myself, in my, like I said, I have 15 minutes 3 times a week with my students, and we have to get through 18 chapters of Lingua Latina this semester. When do I have the time to necessarily, introduce these resources, even though I know that the pros are so powerful? So these are some of the cons, is that they're not always, and it's not mine. I know the pros here, but if somebody comes into my classroom and says, why aren't you focusing on Lingua Latina? That's the textbook, right? So there are these other cons that are associated with the use of them, but I think the pros far outweigh any of the cons. Andrew?
So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the resources and perhaps their authenticity or inauthenticity, neither of them being a bad thing, right, that we produce at LOC, at Latinitas Animi Causa, right? Because what we like to do is produce things for fun. So Ilse, myself, and Claire Meir all produce a podcast, right? We have sort of 2 concurrent running series inside the same podcast, right, that have different episode titles. Our regular podcast, which is unrestrained speech, talking about anything that we really enjoy talking about, things that we like, right? So we've talked about Lord of the Rings. I think our next episode is going to be on the Lord of the Rings spin-off, Rings of Power, right? Because we have lots to say about it.
We haven't watched it yet.
We watched the first episode. We have lots to say, though. We already have lots to say. Then also we have Colloquia Facilia, right, which are specifically designed for novice language learners, right? Not probably novice high, intermediate, low sort of situation. Maybe some novice mid, reaching up to novice high, right? But Colloquia Facilia. So those are specifically resources that are developed for language learners. And we also do Ludamus cum lac, which I've been told by other people bothers them. That doesn't say lacte, but they also understand why not. So Ludamus cum lac videos.
Animi causa, I'm just saying.
Right, indeed. Certe. So omnes lacte alimur, right? Yeah, so, and then, so we play video games chatting in Latin, and this is unrestrained speech as well. This is not made specifically for language learning. This is because we both like playing video games and we both like speaking Latin, so why not marry the 2 things together, right? So we try to do that as well. Anything you want to add to that, Ilse, about our gaming videos or about the podcast?
No, I just love how in the first line we have authentic resource and like inauthentic / made for language learners. I just like that.
Yes.
Carry on.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And then TikTok, right? We have a TikTok where videos are produced for language learning specifically, often for both Latin and ancient Greek, introducing various vocabulary items, talking about what things are done right now, doing a travel vlog of my Florence trip sort of in Latin on TikTok, right? We also have a blog where we create different pieces that are just talking about our daily lives and talking about um, different things that just matter to us, whatever it might be. Ilse, do you want to talk a little bit about the Instagram posts and videos that you do?
So there's not a lot there yet, but most of these so far have been, I think, according to SLA definition, and authentic resources. They're things that either come across or just, I've had like some pop figures that I just take a picture and then write a little blurb about it. It does have an English translation. I found that people really like that. I think it's easier to follow more of what I said because these are like Hagrid was one of them. Not Hagrid, I'm sorry. I have Hagrid on my brain because of today, but yesterday. Hedwig, sorry. So, I have those things. And then I made a post, just about what do you do? Like, this is what I like to do on rainy days. What do you like to do? Type of thing. That is technically an authentic resource. I did not do that specifically for language learners, although it can work for them. I made a short video for specifically my students who are moving on to chapter 7 of Lingua Latina, Verso de Strata, where we went apple picking, right? And technically I did restrain my vocabulary to what I knew that they could do for that, by the time they'd finished chapter 7, talking about the garden and that I'm in the garden and I have a bag full of apples and, so those are some of the things that I've made for that. I'm planning on making a series of Comoro Latine Dicitur that will also be inauthentic. It will definitely be focused on learning the language, but there's more about speaking than necessarily anything else. Yeah.
Bene. Because we're going close, I know we're currently into our question time. To finish up quickly, we have two more things we're going to say. One of the things that is proposed in Henshaw's YouTube video about authentic resources is this question: do we value the authenticity of the resource itself more than the authenticity of what we do with it? Right? I think this is an important question for us to think about, right? I think it's obviously a question that doesn't have an easy answer, but I think that it's important that we're not just, this is where I think we come to problems with things like Wheelock, right? Where it prides itself on the use of authentic resources, but not necessarily on the reading fluency that students can get to by the end of the use of that textbook, right? And so we need to think about the authenticity of what we do with these resources just as much as the authenticity of the resource itself, as it's said, right? And then finally, cuidados, right? Use the resources that meet your goals and the goals of your students, right? Things that you enjoy, things that your students enjoy, things that are good for all of you. And if you're creating resources, try your best to be willing to grow, right? None of us, as we said earlier, is a native speaker. All of us are trying our best, and we're all here to enjoy it and love the language. So, puto nos dixisse, right? Diximus. Gracias, vobis.
Gracias, Luis. So Andrew, actually, did you see Gregory's question? Like, if I make tiered or embedded readings of an authentic text, does it remain an authentic text? And I think Florencia Henshaw does. She like in this in the slides, which Andrew will share in the chat just now. There's a link to her video specifically about what authentic resources are. But if you go to her channel, she does talk about some, like she talks about graded readers, for example. Obviously, these are all within, modern language, modern languages. But I think it's important. Obviously, I think we all agree that it's important to see where we can fit in as ancient languages, because they're not so mutually exclusive as a lot of people unfortunately still believe.
Exactly. Yeah. Very nice. Yeah. And more tears. Love it. Agreed. Nothing. I love tiered readings. Love embedded readings. All awesome. And then Mike, you posed a really good question on the upside. Is a text in a Stedman style commentary still an authentic text? For which I do not have a clear answer. Right. It has been modified for language use. Right. Which would, I guess, be different for its inauthenticity. But again, things exist on sort of a spectrum of some grayness. And so I think that there are authentic pieces to that, right? And I think that like what was posed about the difficulties of authentic resources is that worrying about whether or not something is authentic or inauthentic is less important than choosing a resource that's good for our students, right? So if you find that the Stedman style resource or the tiered readings are things that your students really like and are useful and so on and so forth, then those are useful resources regardless of their authenticity, as it were.
Yeah. And sorry, just what Carla had said earlier about one language does not equal one culture. I think is so important because we view, in general, right? I think that most people view Erasmus as an original or as an authentic text, even in the, in the non-SLA version of this, of the definition, sorry. But he is not Roman, obviously, right? So it's important to think about when we say, okay, this is authentic, where do you cut that off, right? And that's part of what classics is as a whole, it seems to me, is trying to move away from that, the cutoff from, okay, it's only Plautus to, I don't know, maybe Ovid, maybe we'll include Tacitus, maybe, but not really.
Right.
So that's an important thing for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about authentic texts.
Yes, and yeah, and Augustine is that the text, even if it's quite different to the cultural outlook from pagan race, absolutely. Which is why I also include the Passio Perpetua, we include the Passio Perpetua et Felicitatis, right, which is certainly remote from the golden age, as it's called, right, but and has a very different cultural perspective, is nonetheless authentic, and I think a useful text as well. Yep, Einhard, et cetera. Yeah, exactly. All of these people who have traditionally possibly been excluded from classics departments and from the study of Latin are nonetheless authentic resources and useful resources in their own right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it seems that at the basic level of this, we're talking about authentic resources is not just encompassing the Latin of, the golden age, I guess, or silver age or whatever, but then moving more broadly out towards, even up to our time eventually. So it's like this a steadily moving marker, I guess, that we're moving toward. And I think more people are now accepting, later Latin also as part of the Latin tradition. But it at some point it will hopefully get to where we are, right? And I think there are so many amazing creators that have spoken today. So these can be authentic resources. Not everybody makes things that are specifically for language learners. Sometimes we just make things because it's fun to make things. So yeah, I didn't see any other questions to respond to.
I want to thank Mike for sharing your link for your tiered readings. It's fantastic. Gratias tibi. I know, Carly, you're working on a book for Aeneid tiered reading situation, as you mentioned here, and super excited to see that when it comes out. I'll be using the ever-lucking heck out of it. So that's awesome. Gratias tibi. Bene. Okay. Gratias vobis.
Gratias vobis. So we've got a few minutes left. Firstly, let me just say thanks to wrap up. Let's say thanks to Andreas and Ilse. And thanks to all our presenters today, to Gregory, Carla, Mike, Isaac, Irene. Have I forgotten someone? Probably. And yeah, I've really enjoyed hearing everyone's presentations. The chat links, I will save the chat. I will save the chat and put the chat links into an email when I send out emails to the YouTube links as well, so that you will get them as well. But we do have about 5 minutes, so happy to chat about anything. Ask anybody some questions if you like before we wrap up.
I just wanted to say I'm absolutely blown away by all the presentations. Like, that was amazing. And also, for the record, I didn't want to imply that videos are the only thing that you show in a classroom. I don't know if that was ever a thing people were trying to say, but obviously, as Gregory says, you want to have a variety of activities and switching modes and not having the same lesson every single time as well. That is absolutely so helpful. Awesome work, everyone.
Yes, I certainly didn't mean to imply that you were saying that either. And obviously, all of our presentations would get condensed down to like, oh, and so obviously, like, those aren't the only thing I do, et cetera, as well, and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think we're all on the same page.
I also want to extend a personal thank you. This is actually my first conference talk ever. This is the first time I presented at a conference. So I thank you all. Besides, like, I've taught at like Rusticationes and Comitigula and stuff like that, but I've never actually given a paper or talk or whatever. So thank you all so much for being such a wonderful audience. Oh, someone can't open the link. I'll fix it.
What do people think? Should we do this again?
Fiat.
Seamus Khan 2, the Wrath of Khan.
The Wrath of Seamus.
The two Seamuses, Lord of the Rings. No, it doesn't work.
So for the next convention, we're gonna have a cosplay contest.
Oh, yeah.
I think if we did it again, it could be good to have some like sections where there's like controversial discussion questions and we just spend half an hour talking about it. Just have like a place to have the novella conversation.
It's a novella fight.
Litigitous versus novellas.
Novellas strike back. Oh, like it. Novella.
I mean, yes,
hour.
like the novella conversation is like, obviously it's an ongoing one and it's a necessary one, but it's also, it would consume the conversation. But I think there are definitely important conversations to be had about it. And to go back to the question, like there was a question earlier about like what happens if we just let everyone make Latin YouTubes? Like what will happen to the quality? But like in one sense, you can't stop that anyway. Anyone could make a Latin video that they wanted. I'm not sure we're going to put in a Academy of Latin Language Policing to solve that. Like I'm not sure that's the answer.
I suspect the main thing there is that if you're going to make something, then making it well means that more people will use it, and it's a better return on your effort.
Yes.
I think you're right, but I also sometimes get frustrated by how popular certain things are that are not necessarily made well, but that like are like people find, right? And I that doesn't mean like I'm like dissuading people from using certain things. It's just that sometimes things that are not made very well with regard to the mental representation of Latin are still very popular, mostly because we are still learning all about like what is a good mental representation of Latin. So I don't blame anybody for liking some of the things that I'm like, I don't know if you could express it like that, right? But that's me. But or I know that you can't express it like that, for example. But then it's just we're all learning. And a few years ago, I would have been like, oh, this is the best thing ever, because I wouldn't have noticed. So yes, I do agree with the wellness of it being made, but also sometimes we just don't know.
And I think the one thing that's really important in adding on to that in all the novella conversation, YouTube conversation, any conversation is that like, even if the product being quote unquote not well made or whatever, it's still worth it for us to honor the effort and the time and everything that was put into producing that work, right? So even if the end product is not something that we like, like Cicero himself would have written. I often use Cicero because he's held as that like gold standard of Latin. Whether or not he should be is a different story, but like still that person spent many hours in producing that work, and that is worth honoring and that is worth recognizing, and they have added something that is valuable into the community.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Like, so you just said like the courage to put something out there. I'm all with that. Why don't I put those things on Instagram? Just courage, right? And I agree with when Kent used as well, like about the like it doesn't have to, and what Andrew just said, doesn't have to be perfect, right? Andrew has like all these novellas as well, even though we have like this discussion of the novellas and how like grammatically accurate they may be. But these can still be very useful because it's input for our students and it's input that they can enjoy.
And they get invested, they get interested, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I will say, right, like.
Yeah, I use novellas with my students as well. It's like, I may be noticing some things about them, but they will still serve my students well.
Yeah. And I mean, the only way I got any decent at speaking in class, right, was through making videos that I'm sure were, riddled with mistakes. So, but even just having as you know, Andrew sort of said, or Ilse said, like the courage to put it out there then like made me want to do more and that kind of stuff. And it's okay. I think part of it is that we have classics, especially, but a lot of this sort of culture of like, you can never make a mistake. And it's like, no, like, of course my videos from 8 years ago are going to suck and compared to whatever I might make now. Like that's normal. Like I'm growing as a learner. And so I think the same thing with novellas, like, and one of the nice things is it does feel like, you know, there can be a lot of room to edit and improve on these sort of publish on demand type things. That's why, in fact, one reason that I kind of like shy away less from making videos, because the sort of permanence of it. Whereas like those slideshows, like now, and I've had people say like, hey, you know, slide 23, whatever, needs some help there, whatever. It's like, oh, great, nice. And so that's a way that I can. So that actually comes back to the like doing it live versus videoing and, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's
Yeah, if you go to any of Ilse and my gaming videos, you're going to find tons of extemporaneous errors, and that's okay.
Like editing a podcast of ours is like, I literally started the last was Salvete Clara. I said it 3 times. I said Salvete Clara. Like, I mean, luckily I could edit that out, right? Because it's a podcast, but extemporaneously you can't always do that. And that's a noticeable mistake. But sometimes we'll speak and we'll write things, and I think he was the one who mentioned the courage, and it takes a lot to put that out there, and so it's important to honor that. I definitely agree, and it will, like you said, encourage us to make more, and therefore we will get better. So
yeah, exactly. Like we can't get perfect texts that come out of nothing. We'll probably have to go through a stage of writing lots of imperfections before we get great, awesome stuff that is like very Ciceronian. If it's possible, it's just, you know.
If that's what you want.
Well, right. No, and that's a whole other conversation too. And you know, we've had this in other places as well, right? But like, it's in the modern languages too, right? It's like, is like Tejano Spanish somehow inferior because that person's not speaking correct Spanish, and right? And so that kind of stuff, it doesn't make it an inauthentic resource, not by the definition of authentic resource. And you know, those kind of controls on what is correct language have often been used to minoritize people and push them out of things. So it's like, it's give and take, right? It's like, yes, we don't want things that impede understanding and comprehension, but also I think being too strongly tied to like, well, we don't find that in the tiny 1% of ancient texts that we have that happen to survive, therefore it could never possibly have been said that way. I think we risk going the other way. You know, everything's, you got to kind of try and like find whatever that happy medium is.
yeah, I think there was a like very long ago there was a discussion of Makta, right? That's never found, and it's like, okay, well, there's a reason for that. It's, you know, like misogynistic reason for that. So let's like, you know, so why is that what we're going to focus on here? Yeah, no, definitely.
Although I will say the Jungtura Magda where tutes sounds kind of weird, but I'm with Magda just because of the weird tute. I'm joking.
No, exactly.
It's fine.
No, exactly.
Jocos Pergamos.
I'm going to bring us to a close. So thanks again to everybody for making this happen. Thanks to our presenters. Thanks for everybody participating. It's been a real joy, and I've got a lot out of it, and I'm sure you have as well.